Emmanuel Macron's France is in political turmoil. Well, yes, you might say it's also a day with a Y in it. So what? And yet, the recent years of France's political turmoil are arguably less to do with the various political characters, the ups and downs of electoral politics, and more to do with a huge inbuilt crisis that is looming for much of Europe as well as for the UK, and yes, indeed, even at some point the United States. So let's discuss. First, some of the latest nuts and bolts. France has a presidential system, as you're probably aware. Macron remains the president until 2027, unless he listens to various voices that are urging him to stand down early. Why would they be doing that, you might ask? Largely because the National Assembly, the French Parliament, is politically stuck. Macron's centrist forces do not have a majority. Since Macron somewhat foolishly decided to call a snap election last year, it has been even more hung between the far left and the far right parties, which gained support and squeezed the centre. This would be a political difficulty at any time. But France has a big problem. Specifically, it is spending more than it is bringing in, with a budget deficit of over 5% of GDP, with a national debt of 114% of GDP. High by historical standards, very high for one of the core European countries. The French government spending is consequentially the highest in the world at 57% of GDP. This is partly because of the growing cost of pensions, and that's a problem for most of the developed world. As the expectations of the level of services provided by governments have gone up, the size of the state has risen accordingly, and you add to that the fact that people are living longer, hence the pensions bill is increasing, and people are having fewer children. So the rise of young people into the world of work is declining. Fewer workers, supporting more pensioners. And France is logically the country where these particular chickens come home to roost first. In France, citizens can claim their pension from the age of 64, which is comparatively young. In the UK, for example, our pension age is 67. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if someone didn't knock that back by a year or two by the time I get there. Not that I have any intention of retiring, but I digress. Indeed, in France, the pension age was recently pushed back from just 62 years. And should the populist parties of either the far left or the far right gain decisive influence in a future election, it's entirely likely that change is going to be reversed back again. But even before that happens, it still has a longer expected retirement period at 24.7 years per retiree. Not only that, but France has a productivity problem with its existing workforce, creating less GDP per hours worked than Spain, Germany or Italy, and all of which are well behind the United States, although the US is increasing its deficit with significant energy, so don't imagine that gives it a get-out-of-jail-free card. French citizens are not generally minded to take the longer view, to conclude, well, yes, we have to retire later for the good of society. More, they are inclined to be out in the streets protesting in the most vigorous fashion at the first hint of any pushback on the things that they've come to take for granted. By and large, most developed nation populations will feel much the same. It's just the French will be the most active and vocal about it. Macron's centrists have very much been of the view that this is a nettle, unpopular as it is, that has to be grasped, because if not now, then when? His fourth Prime Minister, François Bayrou, pushed the plan for reining in government deficits with spending cuts and tax increases. Really popular stuff, like, for example, eliminating 2 public holidays, but with no wage increases to compensate. That could not get through the Assembly, so he had to use a device that circumvents the Assembly, but in those circumstances that inevitably leads to a confidence vote. He did it, knowing he was likely to face such a vote, and then lose it, but he decided he couldn't be yet another Prime Minister who pretended that continued deficit spending was going to be possible. Normally, that's exactly what happens. The growing older population votes for no change when it comes to France's highly generous pensions, because of course they do. And yes, France's pensions are especially generous. It is the only country amongst developed nations where the relative income of the over 65s is actually higher than the average worker's salary. Chew on that for a moment. The growing pool of mostly economically inactive pensioners, they get more money to live on than those working for a living. Hence, Bayrou was able to present himself as being the champion of younger voters who don't get the benefit of that state spending but will be saddled with the debt burden for it in the future. A valid pitch, but by and large, younger voters are drawn to the unrealistic promises of the populists for more spending today. So in any case, Bayrou lost his confidence vote. Then Macron brought in his fifth prime minister, Sebastien Lecornu. Lecornu tried to navigate France's deadlocked assembly by pitching more to the left, looking to close some of the fiscal gap by raising taxes on the rich. But when it came time to appoint his cabinet, many of them were the same old centrist faces, leading to the pulling of support from the leftist parties, leaving him once again with no majority and no way to win a confidence vote. Hence why Lecornu resigned, having been in position just for a few weeks. And hence also why France, and Macron as its president, is in deep political trouble. Now, Macron could call another parliamentary election, but the polls suggest the assembly would just become even more divided between the extremes, not less. Macron could resign early, call presidential elections, which would seem likely to hand power to the far-right National Rally, the party of Marine Le Pen. Indeed, some are suggesting that Macron might even want the National Rally to take power in the next election on the expectation that its populism, slamming into reality as it would mean it would quickly become unpopular and he could then take it on for the presidency when he's allowed to run again in 2032, maybe the only scenario where he might win a subsequent election. Because, of course, French presidents can't have more than 2 sequential terms, but unlike American presidents, they can return after a break. The thing is that this crisis doesn't affect only France, since the country is one of the big power brokers of the European Union. It is the bloc's second biggest economy after Germany, a member of the G7 in its own right, and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And President Macron has been one of the most proactive forces driving EU policy, particularly on defence and security and on Ukraine. Marine Le Pen's party, stepping into the lead, would send massive shockwaves through European politics, and it would push up existing concerns with the Eurozone economy, because many of its countries face similar dilemmas, they just aren't so far advanced. The price of government debt for France went up sharply with the latest prime ministerial resignation, and the widening spread between French and German bonds, the device that governments use to fund their debt, makes it harder for the EU's single monetary policy to work across the entire bloc. And President Macron increasingly seems like a lame duck president, whose influence on the world stage must therefore be similarly diminished. Around 70% of French citizens want him to go now, and that has the additional effect of discouraging any of the parties in the Assembly from being prepared to cooperate with his centrists, because any such collaboration is likely to taint them, with his deepened popularity, with the presidential elections no more than 18 months away. So yes, France is in a political mess, and that is largely caused by the fact that it's in an economic mess. The populist parties who offer easy solutions based on denying reality, pretending you can just keep spending, their mirages are unsurprisingly quite attractive to voters. And this is the issue we will have across the developed world, and particularly the Western democracies. Because we've seen already how the relatively light burden of policies to move towards net zero emissions for climate change have produced a populist backlash based on just denying that the problem exists. So much so will the case be here as well, where the problem is even more intractable. Some countries will be more ready to face reality than others, but the rise of populists on either the left or the right, and across Europe it's mostly the right at the moment, suggests we will have to go through a phase of democratic decline and grasping for these promises of easy answers before we come out the other side. France may well be the canary in that particular coal mine, and if so, the politics of Europe is going to get a whole lot more volatile over the next couple of years.